We were still rolling when his hand found the back of my neck. The horse kept its Sunday pace on the packed dirt road, steady and unhurried, like it always did. Harness bells rang small and cold in the early morning air, a sound I still hear sometimes when I cannot sleep. Eli reached over without turning his head, without a word, without any change in his expression at all. He took my chin between two fingers and turned my face toward the gray light coming through the front glass. Not gently, the way you might turn a sleeping child's face to check for fever, the way you turn a tool over in your hand to check whether the edge is still true. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and let him do it, because I did not yet know there was another way to be. He checked the cap first, always the cap. 2 fingers at my temple, feeling for the angle, testing whether the pleats lay even and pressed. In our district, the shape of a woman's prayer covering told everyone within a glance exactly who she was and who her people were. Too far back meant vanity, a woman showing off the line of her hair. Too far forward meant something hidden, something a plain woman should not need to hide. There was one correct position, and Eli was the one who confirmed whether I had found it. His thumb would run the center part of my hair underneath, feeling for any strand that had worked itself loose overnight. Loose hair was worldly, they said, and a worldly woman was already halfway somewhere she should not be going. Then the dress, then the cape, then the apron. The color had to be right for the season and right for the district, nothing that would catch a stranger's eye on Route 30 or anywhere else. The hem had to fall at the correct length, not a single inch too short. The cape was pinned, never buttoned, because buttons were considered proud and pins were considered humble, and the distance between those two things was everything. He would run 2 fingers straight down the front of the cape to feel whether any pin had shifted out of alignment. If one sat crooked, he fixed it himself, right there in the moving buggy, his knuckles pressing briefly against my collarbone. The apron had to be tied at the exact place at the waist, the shoes black and plain and free of any shine that might draw an eye. Every single detail was his to verify before the district could see us walk in together and form its quiet, lasting opinion. I want you to understand what that opinion actually meant before we go any further. A man in our community was judged by the plainness of his wife, the same way he was judged by the condition of his fence rows and the health of his animals. A tidy, correctly dressed wife was evidence that he ran a godly home, that he held the proper authority, that God's order was observed under his roof. If her covering sat wrong or a pin showed crooked at church, the shame did not belong to her alone. It landed on him, and he carried it out of the meeting house and back down the road and into the week. So every Sunday morning, before the whole district could see and decide, he checked. The word they used for this was not control, and it was not inspection. The word they used was responsibility. It did not feel like cruelty in the beginning. I want to be precise about that, because the beginning matters more than people think. When Eli first began going over my appearance before church in those early weeks of our marriage, something in me read it as tenderness. I thought he wanted me to look right, so I would not be embarrassed in front of the older women, the ones who noticed everything and forgot nothing. I did not have the vocabulary yet to separate being protected from being managed, because no one had ever handed me that vocabulary. Every set of hands that had ever touched my appearance from the time I was small had introduced itself as love. My mother pinning my first cap, my grandmother smoothing my hair flat before communion, a whole childhood of being arranged by people who called it care. By the time Eli's hands did it, my body had already spent 20 years learning that being adjusted by someone else was the same thing as being held. My name is Miriam Lapp, and my maiden name was Yoder, and I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a few miles outside of Gordonville. I left with nothing except the dress I had on my back and a bus ticket, and a name my own mother will no longer say out loud on the telephone. This channel is where I tell you the things my community spent my entire life teaching me to swallow quietly and never examine in the light. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the version they sell you in the shops along Route 30 where the tourists stop for hex signs and choux-fleur pie, then subscribe and tap the like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this one are worth surfacing. And before we go any further, leave me one word in the comments for how you picture an Amish Sunday morning, because I read every single one and the answers still surprise me. There is a part of what I need to tell you that I cannot say here, not on this platform, not inside these particular rules. The algorithm has edges I have learned to navigate carefully, and some of what happened inside that life sits right up against those edges and past them. So I wrote it down instead, slowly, without the softening that a camera requires, without the cuts. The full account is in something I am calling the Ordnung they never wrote down, 28 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it, the parts the camera is not permitted to show. The link is in the first comment of this video, and that is where the rest of it lives. But before you go there, let me tell you about the morning I failed the inspection, because that morning is where this story finds its center. It was a spring Sunday, the kind where frost still sits white on the fence rails at first light, but the sun is already making promises. It will keep by noon. I had been awake since 4 in the morning. I had milked in the dark with my hands aching from the cold of the pails, cooked breakfast for Eli and for his younger brother who was boarding with us that season, scrubbed the kitchen floor on my knees before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Somewhere in all that rising and bending and lifting, a pin had worked itself loose at the back of my cap, and I had not caught it. A woman cannot see the back of her own head without a mirror, and mirrors in our home were treated as a doorway to vanity, used briefly and quickly, and never looked into for any kind of pleasure. So I climbed into the buggy that morning not knowing, and we started down the road, and half a mile out his hand came to my collar, the way it always did, and this time it stopped. His thumb found the loose pin, the fabric lifting slightly where it should have lain flat against my hair. I felt him go completely still beside me the way a man goes still when he has found the thing he was afraid of finding. He did not raise his voice, that was never his way, but he said very quietly in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language we kept for the truest and the hardest things, that I could not go in like this. He turned the buggy around. We drove the whole way home in a silence so dense I could hear my own pulse, just so I could fix one pin at the kitchen mirror while he stood in the yard holding the reins. And then we drove the whole way back, and we were late, and being late to church in my community was not a small thing, not something that passed unnoticed or was forgiven by morning. But that is the story I am going to tell you, and I need you to stay with me, because the part that matters is not the pin. Being late was noticed the way only a small closed community can notice a thing, completely, permanently, without mercy. Every head in that meeting house did the small involuntary thing that heads do when a door opens at the wrong moment, that flick of attention that lands on you like a hand and moves away just as fast. I felt the heat climb from my collar up into my face, the way heat always does when shame has nowhere else to go. I kept my eyes down the way I had been taught, which meant I saw nothing but the floor and still felt everything. We found our places on the bench, and the service continued around us like water closing over a stone. On the way home that afternoon, Eli did not speak a single word about what had happened on the road. He did not need to, because his silence had a weight and a shape and a temperature I had learned to read the way you read weather. His shame filled the buggy from the floor to the roof, and somehow, without a word being said, I understood that his shame was mine to carry. That understanding settled into me the way cold settles into a house when the fire goes out overnight. A wife's purpose, when you stripped away every softer word they wrapped around it, was to be a thing a man could present to his community as evidence of his own faithfulness. I was 20 years old that morning. I had been awake since 4, had milked and cooked and scrubbed and fed 3 grown people before the light was even fully up, and the sin that hung between us in that buggy like wood smoke, the actual transgression that had weight and consequence, was a single pin I could not see on a part of my own body I was not permitted to examine. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not rush past it because I spent years rushing past it myself. The woman is held fully responsible for the one surface she cannot see without the very mirror they have told her is a doorway to vanity. That is not an accident of the system, that is the system. My friend Rebecca had it worse than I did, and I did not understand how much worse until many years had already passed between us. Her husband did not check her in the moving buggy, where at least the road was empty and the trees kept the secret. He checked her on the front porch every Sunday morning, in full view of anyone who happened to be driving past on the road below. He said a thing done in the open kept a woman honest, and kept a man from being deceived, and he believed this the way he believed everything, completely and without any daylight around the edges. She stood on that porch and let him turn her chin and test her pins and straighten her cape while the neighbors' buggies rolled past on the road, and she smiled the entire time. A woman who did not smile through it was considered proud, and pride was the very worst accusation a plain woman could carry. She told me once, whispering in her pantry with the door half open so it would not look like secrecy, that she had learned to send her mind somewhere far off past the fields until his hands finally lifted away. I did not know then that what Rebecca was describing had a clinical name, that somewhere in the English world there were offices and books and whole vocabularies built around what she had taught herself to do just to get through a Sunday morning. I learned the name for it later, in a quiet room with a box of tissues on the small table between me and a woman who had never once in her life turned my chin toward the light to inspect what she found there. The therapist did not laugh when I told her about the buggy, and she did not give me the tourist smile, the one people offer when they hear something quaint about plain people and want to seem respectful. She went very still the way Eli had gone still when he found the loose pin, but for an entirely different reason and with an entirely different quality of stillness. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said 7 words that I have carried with me every single day since. She said, "That was not inspection, that was ownership." 7 words, and something inside me that had been holding its breath for 20 years finally let it go all at once. Before I got out, before any of that quiet office and those 7 words, my younger sister Katie came to me. She was newly married that year, still glowing with the particular brightness that belongs to a woman who has not yet had time to learn what the brightness is covering. She sat on the edge of my bed, the way she used to sit when we were small girls sharing a room, her feet not quite reaching the floor, her hands folded in her lap in the exact posture we had both been taught before we were old enough to understand what the posture was for. She said her husband had started checking her kapp before church, and she was not sure she was doing it right, and she wanted to know how to make certain she never gave him cause for shame. I looked at my baby sister's hopeful face and felt something break open in my chest like ice giving way in March. I wanted to tell her everything I had not yet found words for, wanted to say, "Katie, the covering was never the point, you are the point, and they are measuring how much of you remains." I did not say it, because I did not yet have those words, in a form I could hand to her across a bed. I only held both of her hands in mine and told her that no pin was worth her disappearing, and she looked at me the way you look at someone who has just spoken in a language you have never encountered, polite and confused and a little frightened. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can count in all the years since I left. I have prayed about it in the particular way you pray when you are not entirely sure anymore who you are praying to, but the habit of reaching outward is still stronger than the doubt. I hope she found her own way to the words eventually, found them the way I found mine, slowly and at some cost, in a room where someone finally looked at her without measuring. I hope the measuring stopped for her before it had to cost her everything it cost me. I cannot know, because her letters came back to me unopened the same as everyone else's, and her voice is one of the ones I no longer hear. When the shunning came down over me, it came the way a barn door swings shut in a hard wind, fast and final, and with a sound you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The letters I sent came back unopened, every one of them, the envelope still sealed with my own handwriting facing outward, like an accusation. My mother would not say my name on the telephone, and after a while I stopped calling because the silence on her end of the line was a specific kind of silence that I could not keep pressing myself against without breaking further. I found my way to the English world the way most people find their way to anything necessary, not gracefully, not with a plan, but because staying had finally become more impossible than leaving. I found the therapist, and I found the words, and I found eventually that the words did not fix the grief, but they gave the grief a shape I could actually hold in my hands. And I want to tell you what I learned because it is the reason I am here on this channel on this particular Sunday, telling you all of this out loud. The inspection was never about the kapp or the pins or the precise angle at which a woman's hair was parted beneath her covering. Those things were only the surface, only what the hands could physically reach and correct. What was actually being examined every Sunday of a married woman's life was whether she had kept herself sufficiently small, whether she had dissolved far enough into the role that no visible edge of her remained. A loose strand of hair was not a problem of tidiness. It was read as evidence that somewhere down inside the woman there was still a self that wanted to be seen on its own terms, and wanting to be seen on your own terms was understood as the first hairline fracture in the entire structure. So they checked for it week after week, thumb along the part, fingers down the cape, they checked for the self. And a good wife learned to hand hers over at the collar before the buggy had even cleared the top of the lane. The fact that some part of me never fully handed mine over is the reason I am sitting here today, and I have made my peace with calling that survival. I will tell you both truths because I always tell you both, and I would not be honest if I let you leave with only one of them. The world I came from gave me things I will carry to my grave, a community with a texture you could reach out and actually touch, people who appeared for every birth and every loss and every collapsed bond without being summoned and without ever sending a bill, a faith that is wounded and complicated and still lives somewhere down in the center of me, whether I invited it to stay or not. Those things were real, and I refuse to pretend otherwise. But there is no scripture that turns a wife into a presentation, no verse that makes a woman the evidence of her husband standing before God, no version of love I believe in now that asks a person to hand over every last visible part of herself before she is permitted to walk through the door and worship. If you grew up somewhere that called the checking love, I see you. If someone arranged you and corrected you and maintained you and named all of it care for so long that you genuinely lost the ability to feel the difference, I see you too. Wanting to be seen as yourself was never the flaw they told you it was. It was the last living part of you, and the fact that it is still in there right now, still reading, still listening, is the bravest thing I know. The full account of what I could not say here lives in the ordnung they never wrote down, linked in the first comment below. Choose your freedoms wisely.